Thanks for having me. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks from a sunny London evening. So it's much later here than where I think a lot of you guys are. Yeah, I mean, my presentation is definitely not as technical as a lot of the previous speakers. I probably come from a different world. I spent the last 15 or so years in banking and payments, so very deep in that world, but largely from a regulatory and standards perspective.
I'm really excited for your talk because a lot of the customers that I work with personally with APIsec are being driven by the exact regulations you're describing.
Thanks so much, Josie, and
Great.
thanks, Paddy, to the previous speaker. The idea of my grandmother using ChatGPT to to commit fraud did make me laugh. So that was a good one. First of all, again, thanks for having me from London. I'll be spending the next kind of 20 to 30 minutes largely talking through kind of from a regulatory perspective what is driving the need for secure APIs with a particular focus on financial services and open banking, if you like that, open finance. But just briefly, here we are because we kind of come from a different part of perhaps the world, so to speak, industrially speaking, than many of you who are here today. So we're Paylume. We're a relatively young consultancy firm, although many of us have been in banking and payments for a significantly long period of time. So we have quite a long set of credentials. We largely work with banks, market infrastructures, and regulators on implementing their payments and open banking strategies and helping them with some of the implementation challenges that they have. Some of that strays into this territory: API implementation, API management techniques, etc. I am not by any stretch a technology person or a coder or a developer, so I'm definitely coming at this from a slightly different perspective. Just briefly about me. So I am the open banking lead at Paylume. I support the growth of our business both in Europe and globally, so very much deep in the weeds of open banking and open finance and how that is being implemented around the world. I've had about 15 years experience now in banking and payments, largely started in payments, and as open banking became much more of a trend, I have been focused on that, developing some of the standards and policy guidance for central banks on all kind of major continents. So have seen every flavor of how open banking can be implemented, you can imagine. Yes, we'll briefly kind of go through the kind of API regulatory landscape and the kind of impact of those regulations, particularly on the security aspect of APIs. And then we'll do a kind of slightly deeper dive into financial services and open banking specifically, with some of the compliance challenges we have seen around the implementation of open banking in Europe. Europe and the UK were some of the first markets to develop open banking solutions. We're seeing that now much more rapidly growing around the world. And some of the standardization efforts that we are seeing both at a European and global level, and what we expect to see over the next kind of 5 to 10 years. And again, as kind of most of you know, and I think this is just a bit of scene setting up front here, that by 2030, we really expect APIs to be at the core of pretty much every single technological advancement, driving about 90% of digital ecosystems. We're seeing them specifically referenced more and more in regulation these days. So before they used to say, I think, very vague terms, general interface terms, but now most regulations are specifically referencing the need for APIs in terms of how to technically implement a particular piece of legislation. Obviously, we all know the benefits of API, so I won't go into that. But it's a relatively new phenomenon in terms of the specific call out for APIs in regulatory text. And just some brief kind of numbers that we've seen over the last few years. Really, 90% of developers are already using APIs. So whilst they might be well used, their potential, I think, definitely in my industry, in banking and payments, may not be as well understood. But, the rise of API management tools is kind of significantly growing. And obviously the rise of internet traffic being API driven is significantly growing. But we're also seeing a significant rise in API vulnerabilities, which means obviously the API landscape is becoming more and more demanding. And like I say, in my side of the industry, the banking and payment side, I think we're seeing a bit of a struggle within some of some of the banks, shall I say, in terms of how to manage this change. Probably slightly difficult to read, but we're seeing, like I said, a significant rise in regulation focusing, in all areas of digital transformation, from AI that I've heard discussed in a couple of the previous presentations, to Internet of Things, privacy, distributed ledger, open banking. These vary around the world in terms of the flavor, perhaps, of the regulations, but mostly they're not inconsistent. There are some common themes and there are some common technical implementation choices that are being drawn out by regulators around the world, largely to adopt what regulators like to call a maximal approach, which helps both the vendors and the adopters, particularly in the banking side where you have multinational banks that are operating in different markets, to enable them to adopt quicker and easier. And I think that is why we're seeing APIs being used and referenced in significant numbers, so that a lot of that underlying API technology can be reused across different markets. But the APIs themselves and even API security requirements are often featured heavily in pretty much all of these regulatory texts these days. Just some examples of existing regulations that impact API security, and particularly API security strategy. So obviously the well-known GDPR, which data protection regulation, that includes obviously provisions around secure data transmission and consent and breach notifications. We have the Digital Markets and the Digital Services Act in Europe now, which forces what the European Commission call very large platforms such as Google, TikTok, Facebook, to open up access to customer data via API and API marketplaces. We have, which I'll go into more detail shortly, the Second Payment Services Directive, so PSD2, which is a European regulation which forces banks and payment service providers to open up customer data and to be able to initiate payment transactions, possibly more importantly, via API. You have the California Consumer Privacy Act, again, very similar to GDPR. And now in the States, although under the current Trump administration, it's largely being put on hold, a similar open banking rule, Rule 1033, which again forces banks to open up customer data to third parties and fintechs. So there is already existing regulation that is enforcing the opening up of data via APIs for the markets. So we'll do just a brief deep dive into the kind of financial in pretty much every single implementation around the world. From a European perspective, though, finance is just one part of a much broader kind of data spaces strategy, where all major industrial fields will need to open up data and enable its free flow across not only just the individual sectors that are under scope of the data spaces, but also across borders as well. All of this is being enabled and enforced via API. Banking has been largely the first to move and become under the regulatory framework, but we're expecting in the not too distant future pretty much all of the other industries to follow suit. In terms of its implementation, but the banking side of things is actually very lightweight in terms of the technical requirements. A lot of that is being market-led. We expect to see the Commission dial that back a little bit and be a lot more stricter in terms of the technical requirements that will place on other industries, largely learning from the mistakes of the banking side. Open banking, whilst to the chagrin of pretty much everyone in the industry, has no real definition. It differs all around the world. We generally agree that it's essentially a system that enables the consumers to grant a third-party access to their banking data through essentially secure APIs to promote pretty much, the four major policy pillars: transparency, so which will enable fraud reduction, competition, and innovation. It's to be seen whether that has actually been successful in Europe in terms of completing those policy objectives, but nonetheless, open banking is live and has been implemented across the European Union and the UK. The UK has a slightly different implementation than the rest of Europe. But the key here is that there are now third parties in the chain that banks must open up customer data to, obviously with their consent. It relies pretty much entirely on open APIs, and those open APIs must be available 24/7, 365 to the third parties that are licensed under the regulation to provide customer data. Banks must also actually provide a 24/7 testing capability for those fintechs to test their API functionality. So we'll come on to this shortly, but largely formulates like a developer portal that the fintechs must be able to access 24/7. And the banks are responsible for implementing that developer portal and providing the documentation to access that themselves. So we see in some other countries, there may be a centralized utility that provides that service. There is a single front door for which fintechs can test their API functionality. In Europe, this is not even done at a country level. This is done at an institutional level. So the burden is 100% on the banks to enable that access to third parties. But what we're seeing, despite some of the implementation challenges, which we'll come on to from a security perspective, is growing. Open banking in Europe is growing at about a 23.18% and to be expected by 2030. As I think slower than some of the regulators would have liked to see. And I think some of the implementation challenges have genuinely presented a barrier. But I think now some of those are starting to be reduced and we're seeing growth at a much more decent level. There are some fundamental security requirements that are linked to open banking. So we have the concept of strong authentication, and the authentication is at various different levels. So between the customer and the bank. So the customer must authenticate themselves to the bank as part of the open banking transaction. Despite the fintechs wanting them to conduct the authentication directly with the customer, it's one part of the process that the banks refuse to give up. So the customer is redirected usually to their banking app to authenticate and permit the transaction. But the fintech must also authenticate to the bank, and that's typically token-based. But also more importantly, or as importantly in PSD2, two-factor authentication must be in place, and the two or more elements must be independent. So there's that is a fundamental requirement of the entire open banking ecosystem. We then have some secure data storage and communication, so the privacy of the connections with data in motion, obviously compliance with GDPR, and storage of the access token. In Europe, we don't have mandatory use of digital certificates, but we're seeing that in other countries, or at least they are recommended. So there's quite a number of fundamental security requirements that are linked to open banking. But from a PSD2 perspective, API security, there are two fundamentals. So the certificate-based client authentication and OAuth 2, the banks must have configurable, reusable, and versioned policies around that. But there are, and have been, and continue to be, significant challenges in compliance with PSD2. Firstly, unfortunately for Europe, and I think we're seeing other markets not make the same mistake, there is not one single API set for open banking across Europe. There are multiple API standards that exist across the EU, and making compliance a very, very difficult challenge. So not only are there different APIs across countries, there are different APIs across banks. There are even different APIs within banks, making it extremely difficult for fintechs to comply. Usually what we're seeing from a European level is fintechs may pick a couple of countries to enter, or even a few banks with higher volume of customers, which has actually kind of devalued the proposition of PSD2 in terms of the competition perspective, because it means that fintechs are only accessing the larger banks because the compliance burden is so high. We expect the Commission to fix this when they move to open finance and move broader than just payment accounts. But unfortunately, we are where we are with this from a European perspective, which makes it extremely challenging. There are some differences as well in terms of open banking API security versus what we see in traditional API security. So obviously, in a traditional sense, in terms of the scope of access of those APIs, is typically for internal use only. What is required from an open banking point of view is that those APIs must be open at all times to fintechs and third parties. So it's different in terms of how those APIs are managed and accessed. From an authentication perspective, open banking relies very much on OAuth 2 as the de facto, with at least two-factor, if not multi-factor authentication. Organizational, in terms of the compliance to those APIs, is organizational specific. Organizations will have their own policies around that. Obviously, open banking from a foundational perspective is based on both PSD2 regulation as well as GDPR and broader banking regulations. In the traditional API sense, it is not expected that data will be shared externally. Of course, that's the fundamental basis of open banking. So it's different in terms of how that data is, stored and managed. It must be secure, transparent, and cross-platform. And then from a security protocol perspective, open banking, uses tokenization, encryption, and API gateways probably significantly more than what you would traditionally use. As I mentioned before, banks are obliged to provide 24/7 developer portals and testing facilities for those fintechs to test those APIs. This is a mandatory requirement. However, what we've seen is that whilst in open banking, there is a limited set of APIs that the banks are forced to open up. What banks have chosen to do, or many banks, not all, is to provide value-added services by using the regulation to invest in their API architecture. They have then provided more premium APIs of which they charge for. So we see that much more in the corporate API space, They may provide webhooks for additional functionality. The regulation only requires that the bank doesn't need to tell the fintech when there's a change to the underlying account that they have access to. But banks have offered that as a premium service that fintechs are increasingly paying for, where they'll get a real-time update when there has been a change on a customer account. But they have started to, some of the banks, particularly the Nordic banks and some in Southern Europe, have actually developed quite sophisticated portals now, as they see this as a kind of shop, a front door for their services, and they have provided much more engaging experiences for fintechs and developers than they have done previously. Some countries in Europe, some banks in Europe have not, and I think they are the poorer for it. So PSD2 has various, which is the underlying regulation, has various architectural components that essentially must work in harmony together. Obviously, you have the automated API management module, the identity and access management module, as well as fraud detection and the original core banking systems. They must all work together in harmony. And we've seen some very scary implementations of this. Some that have done it well have really capitalized on the open banking movement, and the customer experience is seamless. I won't go through all of this, but given that we have had open banking in Europe for a number of years now and the UK, we have started to see some best practices around building PSD2 compliant applications. One of the ongoing conversations, and is still an ongoing conversation despite many years of having this, is this is not specific, I think, to financial services or open banking, but it's the kind of security versus UX debate is still increasingly fiery, I would say, in the open banking community. But those banks that have been the most successful, and those fintechs as well that have been the most successful, have integrated the strong customer authentication process seamlessly. I've seen some horror stories with the banks where that authentication process is about 16 or 17 steps. They still use paper-based authentication techniques on a digital service, but we hope they progress. But obviously, the most integrated and seamless it is, the better user experience. So we're seeing that as a de facto in the UK, it's biometric logins, it's device-based authentication to minimize that friction and to minimize the friction in user experience. We're not seeing that, I think, wholesale across Europe yet. There are some academic conversations around kind of multimodal authentication and behavioral authentication, but we haven't seen any of that implemented in earnest. Token management, so how to handle the token expiration and refresh the logic securely. Consent scope, I'm not going to go through all of this in huge detail. I'm happy to share the slides afterwards. Rate monitoring and obviously error messaging. Just to put on the screen there in terms of a, development compliance checklist, and I don't think this is specific to PSD2. I'm not sure where many of you come from a country point of view. I know many of you are from the US, and if the CFPB rule does end up going through, this essentially would apply to any market. But again, back on strong customer authentication, ensure that it's obviously at least two-factor. We're seeing Auth2, OpenID Connect as probably some of the most popular standards, I would say, when it comes to open banking. The standards, and I'll come on to that in a second, for open banking, I would say in the security space, are probably the most international. Everywhere else, when it comes to the actual data standardization within the API and other forms of standards within the stack, that is very local and very specific to the jurisdiction in which it's implemented. But the actual security profiling we're seeing as becoming a lot more international standard, and FAPI and the OpenID Connect Foundation playing a huge role in that. I won't go through this slide because I know I'm running out of time. We're seeing an increased use of API managers, and we expect that to increase dramatically. Largely, for these four reasons: to delegate the PSD2 requirements, like in particular API security and the authorization side, take care of the implicit API requirements, say rate limiting and the API lifecycle, decouple the published APIs from the downstream landscape and offer that flexibility in terms of published APIs. So there's a huge, I think, requirement in this space for vendors of API management solutions to sell those into banks. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm fortunate that in lots of other areas of banking and payments, actually, there has been a huge standardization initiatives over the last kind of decade or so. Open banking, unfortunately, has not been one of them. It has been very jurisdictional specific. They may lean on international data standards such as ISO 2082, but unfortunately ISO 2082 hasn't really been built for product-based retail banking, which is largely what open banking is at the moment. It's fine for the payment part, but less good for the individual product side. They're not even standardized at national level, let alone international level. But we do see there an open banking framework kind of emerging, which largely falls into four pillars. You have the data standard, you have the kind of security standard, the governance model, and then the kind of, we call it competency. So the specifications in terms of how you would design and develop an API, if not the API itself. Next slide, please. From a security standard point of view, what we're typically seeing now is 5 levels. So we have obviously MTLS, we have EIDAS in Europe, which is essentially the electronic, identification and trust services for electronic transactions. That's largely digital certificates. OAuth 2 as the authorization protocol, OpenID Connect and FAPI. FAPI, I would say it's on the fence how popular it is, but it's becoming more popular. We use this in the UK. It's not so heavily used in Europe. We see it as obviously a high security API profile that can be used for open banking, and I think we'll see an increase in that over the coming years. So yeah, just the last slide on the future trends. So if we take the open banking kind of implementation and scale it out, what we expect to see, and we will see, is open finance. That is coming most definitely to Europe by probably 2028, 2029. We're seeing countries already start with open finance. They don't even bother with open banking. They go straight into open finance as a whole. Usually when a regulator has the authority to operate multiple different parts of the industry, they'll go straight to open finance. And open data, the only country that we're seeing doing open data in any form of earnest is Australia, where they have already started to open up the telco industry and the energy industries. So this is a growing trend. I think my point is here is, whilst there is no kind of, I guess, call to action like in the previous presentation, this is what is coming. There has been a commitment from many governments around the world to open up data, and open banking typically as a kind of more communal industry that is typically used to working together on major schemes is one of the first that is moving. I think what I would say to all of you is, when it comes to things like standardization initiatives, we really need you guys to be involved as much as possible. You are the people that know technically how to implement a lot of these initiatives. And I think some of those standardization initiatives are sorely lacking in your expertise. And thank you so much.
It was awesome,
Of
Lauren. The
course.
first question you got a little earlier on was, should the API have a limit at the usage level maybe, or should the token be limited by IP or user and to help avoid sharing of that token?
Yeah, so I think tokens are limited under PSC2. In terms of limits, what do you mean?
Yeah, that's a great question, Christopher, right? Like, are we talking, like how many times you can use the
Yeah.
token? Or are we talking time frame?
So PSD2 has a cap on the amount of times you can call a specific account in one day. Other countries don't have that, so technically you could keep calling it all day.
Okay,
It really depends on the country and the implementation scenario, but the caps in Europe are actually quite low, largely
interesting.
because the regulators saw that there is not much change on an account.
Somebody else asked, does NSI2 or DORA mention / cover APIs? And it sounds like there is language in some of these regulatory
There
documents
is,
that people
yeah.
could find. Okay.
There is,
That's
yeah.
awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thanks a lot, all of you. Bye-bye.